Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. My name is Carey Nieuwhof, and my goal is to help you lead like never before. So what I do every week is I sit down with world-class leaders and church leaders, business leaders, and I talk to them about what made them who they are and try to have the conversation with them that you would have if you got to sit down for lunch with them or have dinner with them or really got to spend some time with them. So we go into the backstory and we explore what made them who they are and some of the principles they've learned along the way. So if you enjoy this episode, I would love for you to like it, to subscribe, and also to share it with your friends. And in the meantime, here's today's episode. Jeff and Terra, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Carey.
Yeah, it's good to be with you. So we live in an age where I don't know whether you would agree with us or not, but I feel like the integrity gap is about as wide as it's ever been. We have pastors and business leaders and politicians falling all the time. And it always seems to be the same script. You ever notice that? It's like sex, money, or power. And sometimes it gets a little more creative than that. But why can't we seem to solve this one, in your view?
Well, that is honestly comes down to the bottom line of we're sinners, right? We tend to, as leaders, sometimes lose touch with our own humanity and forget what even brought us into our journey of leadership. And often it's from a place of pain. And when we haven't processed or resolved that, it's going to leak at some point. And so just the temptations of leadership pull at all of those things you were just talking about: sex, power, money. So sadly, it is the same script over and over. And we're going to talk about some of those roots today and what drives that. And our hope is that we can shift that trajectory. Maybe we can have a new generation of leaders that are actually living with integrity.
Yeah, it won't happen by accident. It's going to happen with intention. It's going to happen through mentors. And that's the only way to reach this now largest generation before us of emerging leaders and leaders that are already in power and influence and exerting that in corporations, in ministry settings, everywhere. We need people that are walking the talk, and that doesn't mean perfection, to come alongside. And that's what we're about. We're trying to make a dent in that within our little corner and with our little influence, whatever God has in mind for us.
So Jeff, you do some executive coaching. Terra, you are a licensed therapist, a counselor, and you come at it from slightly different viewpoints, but different perspectives, I guess you could say. How does a leader know that he or she has an integrity gap? Like, I've heard over the years, and I don't know if this is true or not, but it's like, if you're the person who says, "Oh, I would never have an affair," you're in danger. How do you, is that true? Like, how would I know I have an integrity gap?
It's a great question. Well, let's define it really quick. I mean, there's so many books about integrity, and what do we look at it like? Integrity is where we say all of our heart, our mind, our soul, our relationships are hopefully moving in a singular, and from our perspective, a God-orientated direction, right?
Yeah.
Not perfect, but it's not an event. It's not, you don't just go to a conference and say, "I'm now going to start living with integrity," or wear a t-shirt, right? No, it's a lifestyle. The reality is that it's a set of choices that we make every day, all day long, over the course of our life. And there's ebbs and flows. So, and who has done that perfectly? Only Jesus.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Every one of us has an integrity gap. The gap is the distance between the values that we preach, things that we say we're about, what we believe and how we live and what's important to us, and the values we actually live and practice. And there's a gap between there. An example might just be, I might say, "Of course I love my wife. I'd take a bullet for her," right? Any husband that loves his wife would say something like that.
Yeah.
Yet, so there's what I'm espousing, there's what I'm saying, and yet I might also say at the same time, "I just can't stop yelling at her." What is this, right? And it's a noble pursuit, we say, to shrink that baby down as much as possible in this life, no matter what worldview you hold. But especially if you are a follower of Christ, you're naming that as something you value and espouse. It is a noble pursuit to shrink that down. We can't do that on our own. We have to do that in relationship with Him and with each other.
And I'd say those warning signs is when we're minimizing that, right? When we're saying, So what? I yell at my wife once in a while. We're all sinners and fall short of the glory of God. Yes, that's true. But can I be honest about the fact that that isn't the God's best for me? Mm-hmm. Not in shame and guilt, but in a true sense of humility to say, that isn't who I want to be. And that's not how I want to treat my wife. And so those are the places of vulnerability, is when we dismiss it, we ignore it. And over time, it gets louder and bigger. When there's a lot of warning signs that we'll talk about more, and we talk about 10 particular symptoms. They're not exhaustive, but there are red flags for us to say, hey, we're kind of in danger if we're not addressing this. And we wrote the book in a way that we could all kind of look at it and be able to go through, where am I struggling right now in my life, in my leadership? And then I can hone in on that chapter for a season.
Yeah, okay. I would like to go through the 10 signs because I think that'll be interesting. But let me ask you a question first. So a lot of the people who listen to this podcast are in a public role. You're either the pastor at a church, it could be a small church, still public role, or a larger church. Lots of large megachurch pastors listen to this, executives, CEOs, founders, entrepreneurs, business owners. So we all kind of have a public role. We're leaders, right? It's a leadership podcast. Does that put extra pressure on the integrity gap? Does that make it harder? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can start. I'll just say it does. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, the role of leadership, period, is traumatic in and of itself.
Yeah. It doesn't matter whether you have a public profile or not. It's hard.
The more influence that you have, the obviously that can increase in terms of just how you navigating the challenges that exist there. So for sure, as leaders, we say that if you have a following, you're a leader. So if you're a mega church pastor, or if you're a Fortune 500 CEO, or you happen to be a parent that works at Starbucks, but you're parenting, you're a leader if you have a following. That's the fact. And how you live and lead matters to everyone in your wake, whether you have one person in your wake or thousands. We take that seriously. We think that Christ takes that seriously. And if you're a follower of Jesus and you're in a public role that's not vocational ministry, say you're a business leader, God wants us to take that seriously in the stewardship of every resource that He's given to us, just like He would the church, capital C or lowercase c.
Yeah, and I think the struggle with the more influence we have is we lose sight of who we are as Jeff and Terra. We start to believe our own press, and the voices become, multiplied. Everybody critiques us as a leader, right? The more public you are, the more people think they have a right to tell you who you should be, who you shouldn't be.
Yeah.
And so learning to live with the voice of one and a few of your safe people is a discipline that is required to make it in the long haul of leadership. And it's really hard, and we're all vulnerable to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I've found like leadership is complicated. So your day job is not easy. You're solving problems that you get paid to solve and that often other people can't solve. So, welcome to leadership. And then you're right. As things get bigger, it feels like I have found that I've had to actively resist not wanting to be vulnerable. In other words, it was easy when I was starting out and things were really small to go, hey, I messed up yesterday, or here's what I did. And there's this, Lisa Turkhurst and I have talked about this on this podcast before, but there's almost a pressure to be the master, to say, hey, 15 years ago, I struggled with X, but now I don't have any problems, right? And that's, first of all, not true. And is there a pressure the bigger things get to pretend that things are better? Is that normal? What do you guys find?
Yeah, I'll just say that as humans, we have a tendency for hero worship. And this is a tendency, right? So leaders can know that. And I'm not saying every leader is knowledgeable of or thinking about that and likes that or wants that or uses that in an appropriate way. But the fact is that as you grow in influence and you have more people looking to you, and the tendency is to be placed on a pedestal. And then, as Terra indicated, that we are vulnerable as leaders because we're human. And we long, all of us, to be known and to know others, to like that too much and to begin to start believing our own press and isolating. And isolating, why? Because we need to keep up that image that everyone else that we're working to manage,
a lot of pressure,
that people have about us. And that then increases pressure. It's just one of the vulnerabilities that we're.
Yeah, social media does not make that easier, does it?
No, absolutely not. And it's been one of the beasts that we've had to, be able to rein in our own health and wholeness as leaders ourselves. So it's one of the things that we need to consider as leaders is the dual relationships, particularly in the church as well. Because when you've got a smaller circle, you can kind of delegate your different hats a little bit more. But all of a sudden now, you are best friends. Now you're colleagues. Now you're the boss. Now you're, the world leader systemically. And it's hard to find those safe people the larger your wake of influence is. And so the expectations get pretty high. And I would say the systemic problem is in the followers too. Followers put too much pressure on leaders to lose sight of their own humanity as well.
Yep.
Yeah, just to confess, and I want to come back to some of what you said in a little bit, but just to be totally transparent, my wife and I were doing a live Q&A the other night on Zoom, and I was helping her with it. And we went in a half hour early and it wasn't set up the way I wanted. So we almost had this little argument before we were doing a marriage seminar. And I'm like, wow, this is not cool. But it was all me, and I'm like, I thought I had this vision of how it was going to go. And then I didn't like the way that I was approaching things. And I'm like, how do you, did I hear that you were in practice? Did you say 15 years?
Uh-huh.
Okay, so you would have a little bit of a pre-digital practice. A lot of sociologists, psychologists would say around 2012, 2013, that's when things really started to take off. So you started 2005-ish?
Yes.
Was there a difference you saw 15 years ago from what you see now in the pressure? Did social media change it a little bit?
Yes, drastically, actually.
Okay.
The overwhelming sense of what Jeff's calling the image, people started getting an idea of their brand, right? What's
right.
In line with how I want to present myself to the world. So now, I'll confess my own control issues. I'm just like, hey, Jeff, you can't wear that because it doesn't mesh with our brand. Those are issues that couples face when you're going to church on Sunday morning and you have to get over with.
Right.
Jeff's like,
you're so off brand on Sunday. You know that, Jeff?
Right.
Totally.
Yes,
but
I am.
When it comes to a larger podcast or again, a more public role, there's just a lot of that complexity that goes on inside our own heads. But I would say the greatest pull has been also on our time.
Yeah.
It's been the biggest time sucker for leaders, just in turning into another addiction and a way to avoid our inner life and our relationships that matter most to us.
And what it does to the neurobiology, right? We've seen, I'm not privy to Terra's counseling sessions over all those 15 years, but I could hear her come and say, it's just amazing to me. And over, even just as the spouse, just to recall conversations that we had about just what she was seeing about how people were coming in numbed out on the early end of the digital invasion, if you will, we call it. It's like, so, what it was doing to a leader's brain, right? And people bringing their technology, their devices into a counseling session and being on them and having her as a counselor, having to actually have them put the devices down.
Can you put that away? We're here to talk about your social media addiction. Can you put that away?
That's right.
But we think we're too important sometimes, right? That's part of the issues as leaders. The world can't go on without us.
And
that we can talk about that more in a little bit, but that is part of that dynamic.
I just got to answer this text. Sorry, guys. I'll just be back into right. That kind of dynamic.
That's it. And then just the dopamine hits that people were even on the early front of it, and where they are now, it's just it's overwhelming. It's so the majority of people we see both in the counseling space, but also in the coaching, organizational development, business side of things, right? And you can get away with a few things in business environments, and there's some protocols that are in place in certain environments that don't allow for those kind of interruptions. But it just depends on the culture of the org.
Right. You talked about some signs. Feel free to walk us through all 10 or pick some of the big ones. I'd like you to read our mail about our integrity gaps.
Yeah, one of the biggest ones that actually is hard for us to connect the dots, but it is the fact that we have unresolved trauma. We've found over the work of 20 years between ministry, private practice, executive coaching, and working with a lot of high capacity leaders, is that a majority of them have some sort of trauma from their younger years that never was resolved. most trauma survivors kind of fall into two camps. We either become victims and keep getting re-victimized, or we become overachievers and will never be victimized again. And we become performers to be able to lay what we would call marble on dry rot, kind of a continual layer of looking good and making sure that I keep people at bay and they won't go deeper. And so that's what I found in my counseling office is a spouse would bring a well-loved leader into my office, or children start acting up, in their teen years, and mom and dad can't hold them together. And there's these unresolved traumas that need to be addressed. The truth is that every change agent in the world has probably had a pretty horrific story of some sort. And that, again, we can push that towards doing bad in the world, or we can really make change because we're not scared of hard. That's part of the results of trauma.
How do you define trauma? Like, are you talking about the ACE test, the adverse childhood experience? Is it something else? How would you define that?
Yeah, great question. We define it a little more broadly in that it's anything out of the ordinary. So if you weren't supposed to lose your child and you lose your child, if parents aren't...
Like, you mean in a crowd or something?
Yeah, or to death. I mean...
I get it. I didn't know what you meant. Okay.
Yeah, marriage falling apart, ending up in addiction, or having a spouse who's an addict.
Right.
Anything that's out of the ordinary. Losing a job, again, ministry, through just the change of economy. A lot of people having to shift.
So getting fired, getting furloughed, getting laid off.
Anything unexpected. If I'm driving to work and I don't expect to be in a car accident, and I get in a car accident, that's traumatic. What happens with the trauma is what turns into post-traumatic stress disorder. If I'm not finding care and comfort and been able to process it, then it will get stored in my body and cause all kinds of kind of ailments and different things that will leak out in funky ways.
Maladaptive coping strategies.
Yeah.
Carey, this is something that's not new to you, is that, leaders minimize trauma all the time, right?
Yeah.
And actually what we need to do is we need to get in touch, actually, and it's part of a maladaptive coping strategy to overcome or achieve. How many times have you heard a leader say, well, that was my past and here's what I've done since then? Or how could my past be impacting my present? It's not. And I'll show you how it's not, right? But yet that's a huge tell that they actually have unresolved trauma because they leak. We leak when things aren't addressed and worked through. As Terra described, trauma, the neuroscience is awesome. Just revealing what we've known as followers of Christ about God's design for our brains for so long. It's just so many cool things are happening right now. And what we know is that trauma is stored in the body. And it takes, that's why talk therapy sometimes doesn't work. You have to use some other tools that connect to the brain, and the rewiring of the brain. Neuroplasticity is possible. It's incredible.
Yeah. So that's the idea. The body keeps the score, right? My wife's reading that book right now. I'm sure it'll get to me eventually. Apparently it's quite dense. So maybe I'll get to page 3 and give up. I don't know. But that whole idea, right, that these vague, undiagnosed, or sometimes very diagnosed things can actually be anchored in trauma, that mind-body connection. Here's a question. I don't know if you can answer it or not, but it's because I've thought about this. And if you look over 400 episodes of this show, you'll see evidence of that. Do more overachievers end up in leadership than people who, because the way I would phrase it when I look, and this is like totally amateur opinion, so take it and turn it into your professional stuff, okay? But like I would say when you have trauma, you either implode or you explode. You implode in that you succumb to addictions, or I can't do anything right, and you kind of end up on the margins of life, or you overachieve, right? You kind of explode and say, no, I'm going to succeed. I'm going to make something of myself. So you become the A student, you go on, you become a doctor, you become whatever, you become the CEO, the boss, and you're kind of compensating for that. So one kind of works for you, the other works against you. In the end, the unhealthy motivations all work against you. But do you think that leaders are overrepresented in that overachiever as a response to trauma? Or do you see victims in leadership as well? Or like, what do you see?
Oh, that is a great question. I think that's spot on. And I actually think we see both in leadership. But majority probably would be the high capacity. Leaders are going to be the overperformers. Yeah. But again, in the definition that we have for leadership, if you've got a following, you're a leader.
Right.
if you're imploding inwardly, you're going to be impacting everybody in your wake. So the high capacity leaders, overperformers can just smooth people. They're the ones that landed in my office, and the other counselor said, "You guys are doing awesome. You seem to have life together. Why do you even need to be here?" And we have really strong sniffers because we look the part. People always think we have it all together until you really get to know us. Oh yeah, they're kind of human too. But that idea of we have strong sniffers for the overachiever who's been able to fool everybody else and has the disconnection to their inner victim, the one that has all those voices in there that's saying, "You're messing up again. Nobody loves you. If they knew," all of those internal voices. The only one that doesn't have those internal voices are really the true narcissists who really are constantly telling themselves they're pretty amazing in order to protect a little ego. And we can process that a little bit more, but we do see more and more narcissists in leadership today.
Jeff, what does your sniffer tell you? How do you sniff out an overachiever? Because I look at I was like, I don't go to counseling. This is me in my early 30s. I don't go to counseling. I send people to counseling and look at how awesome things are going right now. And then I realize, oh, you're a train wreck, Nieuwhof. Like, shut up. How do you smell that out?
Well, one of the ways is just by what you just said, right? It's arrogance is a chapter that we have in our book on a symptom that leaders are vulnerable to. And we both would be vulnerable to that. Every leader at some point in time is going to be vulnerable to that mindset of my way is the best or my thinking is the best. I'm better than everyone else in their mind. They may never say that with their mouth, but motives are the tipping point. And so if you hear yourself or you get some feedback from some others that are beginning to just not get the things that you think that they're saying, that you're saying to them, and transferring information isn't working, and it's becoming kind of a pattern, we might look at a blind spot and begin to evaluate. And this is what's so important. We think that within high capacity leaders, for sure, those with the greatest influence on planet Earth right now, they must have at least two people that are not reporting to them, that are not where their livelihoods are not attached to it, that are mature and healthy, and that leader can receive influence from. Actually, receive influence from those types of people in order to stay grounded, to stay rooted, to stay in reality. Because every leader is going to be vulnerable to believing, like Terra said, their own press, and to that arrogant mindset. The sniffer comes also when leaders isolate. If I see a leader that is isolated and insulated from other people, and not, they have a hierarchical organizational structure which insulates them at the top, and they have their commanders that you have to go through in order to get to them, and you can never get to them. That's definitely a red flag for us. Why is that? And that is not the best organizational best practice model. We're seeing those tiers be deconstructed in the last, particularly the last 15 years. And so isolation is another red flag, a sniffer. What else would you say?
I would say I'll talk about my own. As we were writing this book, Carey, I came face to face with some of my own burnout. I was writing the burnout chapter, and I'm talking about all the red flags of, again, thinking I'm, especially in the church at large, leaders who think it's up to me, I'm doing good, I'm dying to myself. I mean, those are kind of the truths of work. This is kingdom work. And we push until our bodies break down. And again, things that are being stored in the body are fighting against us. And it was coming out in major irritation. And here I am writing a book on integrity. And I'm like, I'm the biggest fraud ever. But I had to come face to face with just my own humanity to say, I am doing too much and I'm going to have to disappoint some people. And that goes against a lot of my lies that I fight to not disappoint anyone, and to make sure that I can hold it. I can be the strong one. That's oftentimes what I hold. And I know a lot of leaders who are listening can resonate with that. I can be the strong one here. But in turn, I was hitting a wall and I needed to do some prevention work. And so I took a little sabbatical from working with clients so that I could really finish this book and do it well and stay married. I mean, honestly.
One of my goals too, just stay married, try to be happily married. Yeah.
Yeah. But those are some of the things that you have in order to stay integrous, is to say, okay, where am I right now? And what are the things that are becoming patterns? Okay, I can be irritable once in a while. That's being human. But when it's a pattern and I'm really annoyed with my family continually, I must be being too squeezed outside of my my capacity.
And we've got kids, and kids tell the truth, right? and our soon to be 14-year-old daughter and 12-year-old daughters are, here's an area, right, for us to decrease our integrity gap. We want to give the best to those that we love the most. That's what we say. I say that about my wife. She says that about me. We say that about our daughters. How are we doing that, right? And so what we try to do is we're trying to practice what we preach here. And writing this book is as much for us as it is for anybody else. It's a built-in deterrent to do the things that we know what it takes in order to make it to the long haul. So asking our kids even, how am I influencing you right now? Or what was this last week like in our relationship for you? Questions like that, and being willing to receive the feedback from them, because we actually really care about having the kind of relationship that we talk about. We don't want to just talk about it. We want to have it. And what they say means a lot, bears a lot of weight, more weight than outside those concentric circles of priorities in our relationship with God, our marriage, our kids. A lot of things then fall out in different order after that. And so we're very much trying to be practitioners of this and taking it to the streets and sharing it, but really making sure that we're living it authentically. And we have people in our lives that are helping us do that, right? Thank you. Shout out to our counselor, Deborah.
That's awesome. What are some other signs that there might be an integrity gap? You mentioned trauma. You mentioned blind spots.
Isolation. Leadership itself is isolating. I mean, the more you go up in the tier of leadership, the more isolating it can be. Less people can relate.
There is a naturalness to that, though, right? And particularly when things start to scale, like when we had 20 people at our church, I was available and accessible to everyone. And it's not that hard, right? It's like, and I got time left over. It's not that hard. Now, with social media and then just with this podcast and the platform of, almost 2 million leaders a month will access our content, and you just get bombarded. So how do you not get isolated?
So good. I would say the key is, who are those 2 or 3 people that get your time and are part of the inner circle?
So you're not saying everyone should have it. You're just saying you can't have nobody have it.
Exactly. And what happens is you start, I'll just say in my own journey, as well as walking alongside many leaders, we start to become more mistrusting of people the higher up we get. What are they after? Do they really know me? Do they really want me? Are they going to criticize? What do they want from me? Everybody wants something from me as a leader.
Yep.
So knowing who those 2 or 3 people are, they get your time. And then we get to decide as a leader who gets the rest of our time. And so do not give it to the masses. And I think there is wisdom, and that goes to the burnout chapter, right? There's wisdom on who gets my time and how can I make sure that I'm managing my time well. But we talk about survival. We talk about narcissism.
What is survival? And then I do want to camp on narcissism.
Good. Yeah. So our tagline for survival is that needs are a sign of weakness. Mm-hmm. And we perpetuate that mindset in and outside the church in leadership all the time. And we may even, it's kind of popular right now to talk about being a vulnerable or a servant leader. I mean, Robert coined that term in the 70s. And yet it's, there's sort of popularity cycles of words and phrases that are sort of out there. Living it is a whole other story. We can talk about it, books have been written, but living it. And so actually having appropriate vulnerability in your place of leadership, what does that do? When a leader is appropriately vulnerable about what they're feeling, something that's happened culturally or that's impacting, production or sales or whatever it might be. When they're vulnerable appropriately to their people, they model that that's okay. It's okay to be human. It's actually part of the antidote, if you will, to this vulnerability of survival mechanisms, right? We have a survival mentality, stepping in towards people, showing them how, and being that authentically is transformational. It will help others do likewise. And that impacts systems. That impacts homes. That impacts organizations, for-profit, nonprofit. I don't care where you're at. It's powerful. So needs and having needs and not having all the solutions all the time, people don't trust that anymore, right? When leaders come across that way. Appropriate interdependent relationships is the key. Not codependent, not needing to air your laundry out all the time and trying to get your needs met in unhealthy ways.
Yeah.
We'd say that that's the sign of unhealthy leaders. Wholehearted leaders aren't trying to get their needs met from other people in unhealthy ways.
So yeah, can you drill down on appropriate vulnerability? I think we could do a whole episode on that, but I'm just curious because you're right. People either under-disclose or they over-disclose, right? So there is no secret and everybody hears everything and it's like, you should, that should be at your therapy session. That should not be from, at the staff meeting or whatever that happened to be. And then others, it's like, I'm bulletproof. I have no issues and I'm not vulnerable at all. So where is appropriate vulnerability?
It's a fine line and a hard dance that we probably tip into each side of those, right? As we're learning how to do that. The airing out your story that's not yours to tell. I always say, think about if I was telling a story and being vulnerable, had Jeff and I talked about this story? Does he trust that we worked through it, or am I just throwing him under the bus in my vulnerability? And being able to recognize, have I actually processed this with my inner circle yet before I'm doing this publicly, either with my organization or on social media, which is the younger generations tend to start there first. They're going into the person who actually really knows me really well. It is actually more vulnerable to go to my inner circle and to talk with them than to put it out on the table with people who don't know me very well. And so there is an actual process that we need to go through first, orders of steps. Have I talked to God about this?
Right.
Have I talked to my inner circle? And then I can bring it into my organization and modeling that. I think the other appropriate vulnerability is, again, normalizing emotions. Like if we're going through something globally, like we are right now, just being able to acknowledge, like, this is hard. It's hard for me right now to go through the holidays in a pandemic. There's a lot of losses. That's a global humanity piece versus being like, I'm fine, no big deal. Why are you making a big deal about this? That's that hard-hearted lack of vulnerability that's unhealthy. It makes everybody else never want to share anything with you ever.
Can we talk about narcissism? You're saying it's on the rise. I heard you say that. So how do you know you're a narcissist? What?
A true narcissist will never ask themselves that question.
But wait, this is probably about me. So let's continue. No, I'm kidding. That was a bad joke, but yeah.
Yeah, I'll start maybe by saying that narcissism is a spectrum, and every leader type, right, might find themselves hopefully on the softer, earlier side of that spectrum, where we have a tendency to believe our ideas are the best, or our innovations, or our thoughts, or what have you, right? So that's a real subtle side that we just need to be aware of and address, and have some positive deterrents in our world to keep us from moving further down that spectrum. True narcissistic personality disorder, what's being discovered now is that it's widely undiagnosed, and there's more of those type of leaders in every segment of society in leadership than we would ever know. And it's starting to become more known, and people have begun to write about this, and we're taking a stab to kind of address the fact that it's a real issue, both in and outside the church. Our heartbeat, of course, is for inside the church, capital C, wherever it may be found. But there's predatory behavior, and that's the narcissistic personality disorder, where there's really no empathy. They cannot literally see themselves of having done anything wrong. Their brains.
So no empathy for others. You see yourself as, well, there's nothing wrong with me. Okay.
It's always you. It's always going to be you.
Yeah. And it really gets locked in between ages, 2 and 4.
They're little 2-year-old in terms of emotional arrest. Yeah.
And that can get played out, of course, if you're dealing with a senior pastor or a CEO who is in their 50s their 60s. And they've been living in that space, getting their needs met in unhealthy ways and using everyone around them for all those decades. That is really, really difficult. You can look at the wake behind a leader like that and you can see the carnage.
Yeah. Any other signs that you're a narcissist?
The signs that you're a narcissist, you tend to defend every decision that you ever make. If somebody disagrees with you over time, then you will start to make them out to be the enemy. And you'll see a pattern with narcissistic leaders that their staff doesn't stick around very long, or they get booted out and then they go start over in a very completely different community or sector to find a new group of people who will think they're amazing. Most narcissists are pretty charismatic and know how to woo people into their inner circle, and they attract actually those victim type trauma survivors. Wow. And it's a really icky system. And so we're just trying to speak out to say, hey, we need to start being a little more thoughtful about who we're putting in places of leadership. Just being wooed by people's charisma and their talents, it can be really dangerous. Now, all of us who are leaders, did you?
No, you keep going. I'm just really reacting. This is good. You're making me think.
All of us have a danger of moving down that continuum, but I would say the true NPD does not ever ask, like, am I a narcissist? Right. And they don't really care. And they use people as a means to an end. Yeah. So you'll see this pattern happening. And many who are listening have been in those systems, right? Yes. Where that leader can do no wrong. And the people who think they're amazing are in their inner circle. But over time, people start to see the true colors. Yeah. And those people will turn to enemies right away. So healthy, wholehearted leaders who have a little bit of narcissism in it will hear feedback. We're willing to get, we're willing to say, okay, I can grow there. Thank you for that. I keep people in my inner circle and in my outer circle who are willing to give me honest feedback. And I have to work really hard to not let it impact my identity. But a narcissist just has a really fragile ego. So they need everybody to think they're amazing.
I think we did an interview with Ern McManus. I'm going to link to it in the show notes, but we had an interesting conversation about narcissism. And I don't know whether it was in that or somewhere else I was reading, but it's like 30% of CEOs and lead pastors may qualify as narcissists clinically. It's a stupidly high percentage. You said something, and that's what made me react. That was my face a few minutes ago. About selecting, like, is there a selection process when you're interviewing staff? Like, are there questions you can ask? Is there a process you can lead them through that would help you identify someone who maybe has highly narcissistic tendencies? Because I agree, they can be very dangerous team members, board members, whether it's your senior leader or whether it's somebody on the executive team, that can derail an organization quickly.
It sure can. We're huge advocates for, and actually working with a number of churches, for example, or organizations, but particularly churches, that to help them to expand their timelines and deepen their vetting processes. We've tried to do that in our own process here within our organization, Living Wholehearted, and to have like a 5-tier step of candidacy that is asking hard questions and not assuming. We make so many assumptions, and where there's needs, and there are needs everywhere, we try to fill seats so fast. And we do so at our own peril many, many times, putting people in positions before they're ever ready to handle influence and authority and power. And it's not that they can't, it's that they're not ready yet, perhaps. But there are those predatory narcissists that are out there that are looking to get into access where they can abuse. And Glenn Ball and Darrell Pulls, they wrote a powerful book and they're really on the forefront of this research for church leaders and the plague narcissism. That's what their book is. Let Us Pray, Prey. And the subtitle is The Plague of Narcissist Pastors and What We Can Do About It. We highly recommend it. And we leverage some of their research indicating just how big of a problem it is in the church. Actually, and their research came from one denomination up in your territory in Canada.
Oh, wow.
Overwhelming how many pastors fell into and met the criteria for NPD, undiagnosed.
I'm going to have to read that book.
Yeah, it's a necessary read. The other thing, we tell a story right off the start in our book about our first ministry experience. Jeff was underneath a pastor who actually ended up being a professional embezzler in the end. And one of the things that they didn't do and perceive, I mean, they gave him the entire rights to the entire church, a small church in Seattle. But he was the one signing all the checks, and he had 100% control over the church's finances. His main part of his story was the past was this past. Lord had forgiven him, and there was no track record. Nobody could find out his history. And this church that believed deeply in grace and forgiveness accepted his story as is. And so it seems so like, oh, we don't do that in our organization. But I would say majority of the process of hiring, particularly in Christian organizations, we aren't asking people's stories. There are HR, human resources laws in place that we have to be careful there. But there is a part of knowing someone's character, knowing why they aren't working at other places. And a narcissist will be really good at skewing the story that they're always the victim in every situation. And I want to hear, what part did they play? How did they grow? What did they learn from that? What did they participate in? And not just singing their praises. But you'll hear that if someone truly has a record of harming, you'll see a wake in their path. And we have to do due diligence to go check that out.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's a good, I mean, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I imagine this plays out over the entire spectrum. So it tends to make the news, or we tend to hear stories when there's someone who led something large company, large church, mega church, narcissist or has an affair or whatever. But this is actually happening in every size organization, every size community. Is that fair?
Correct.
Yeah.
Every segment of society, you're finding this. That's right.
Yeah. So just because you're a church of 50 doesn't mean you won't be led by a narcissistic leader necessarily.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Those that are truly like that are looking for the vulnerable scenarios where they can set up their plan, and they literally are very strategic.
Is this a plan? Like this is like intentional?
That's right.
Very
wow. Okay.
Very intentional. And they literally are. What are they doing? They are looking to get their needs met in unhealthy ways. They're going to do that very strategically and have backups to their backups, so that if they're caught, their initial backup will hopefully cover. Right. So they look for vulnerable people who are going to be less believable. They think if they testify or share that they were abused or whatever, fill in the blank. Because they are marginalized in society in general, or what have you. They get very strategic about keeping up the appearance. And this happens to be just sort of one of our areas of wheelhouse. And we've worked with those in the predatory narcissistic spectrum, but mostly they're victims.
Yeah.
And that's who's come through our doors for 20 years.
So the predatory narcissistic personality disorder, then they know they're doing this. They're like, this is part of their plan. They're like, okay, so this is premeditated. Which also leads to the integrity gap when you think, okay, so this is a person who's likely to take money or to pursue women or men, or like, do these things run together?
Oh, they're all linked. And when you think about the core needs of humans and how they want to get those needs met in unhealthy ways, right?
Yeah.
Their needs weren't met when they were in that 2 to 4 age range. And whatever their story is, that's the bottom line, is that emotional needs, maybe more, weren't met. So they had to get those needs met in other ways by themselves, and to insulate and protect their small egos, and to survive, a survival mechanism. They started preying on others to get those needs met, using others to meet those needs.
And yet, if we think of the spectrum, and I guess that's the more extreme situations, and they are everywhere. So we honestly see it more and more and more, and are trying to call attention to it, to say, hey, we need to work together to not let these leaders be the ones that keep leading our organizations. But on the other side, all of us fall in a spectrum of trying to get our God-given needs in unhealthy ways. I think that's one of
there's a much less malevolent side of that too. Whereas I'm not necessarily going to prey on you, but I really need you to like this. And I really need you to tell me that I did a good job. So it's not, there's no offense there. It's just dysfunctional. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly right. And I think that's the more sobering kind of place for all of us keeping that in check and making sure, what is the need? What do I really need because of my unmet childhood needs? We didn't all become narcissists, but What am I trying to get need met? Do I need to be liked? Am I trying to find significance? Am I trying to find love, intimacy? And then how do I do that in healthy ways versus unhealthy ways?
And that's where it becomes more innocent and less premeditated.
For sure. And
unconscious.
Paying attention Paying attention to that pull, though, takes it from the unconscious to the conscious. Like, why am I feeling this right now? Why did I have such a negative feeling about that conversation I just had with a coworker? Like, what was that? Where is that? And trace it back. Learning to trace it back to, am I believing a lie about myself? Am I believing something that isn't true? And weighing that and getting objective about what's going on inside. Not just in your mind, but in your body even. Like, I didn't even know my triggers. We talked about trauma and triggers. I didn't know what my triggers were until like 10 years ago, actually, which seems so funny. But I clench my jaw and I do this with my hands. And Terra was like, well, I know you clench your jaw, you do this with your hands. And that was a trigger for me when I was beginning to slip into that kind of anxiety space or stress that would lead to conflict strategy. And knowing that about myself, it's connected to some trauma stuff that I had to work through and just make a connection on. Integrating that allows me to catch myself quicker now. And we want to help leaders to learn to notice what's going on in their bodies, right? So that they can do what we call regulating. That's in the clinical world, just a great term, regulating. Every adult right now needs to be working on that. Every kid needs to be working on that. And as we do that, we grow and mature so that we aren't trying to get our needs met from others in unhealthy ways.
This is so rich. Any other signs you want to cover?
Well, there's
not that all of our mail hasn't been read to some level so far, but
I guess, one of the things that we all can relate to is the guilt and toxic shame.
Oh yeah, I want to talk about shame and guilt.
But that, again, the further we get where our outside life looks really great and our inner life hasn't been addressed, that gap gets larger and larger, and we start to feel that shame voice gets louder and louder. And it is the enemy. The enemy loves to use shame to keep us apart from God's grace and his love, and to keep continuing to remind us that we're not worthy. But that is something that is a small, subtle voice. We often shove it aside, but learning how to listen to when a conviction of when I did something wrong and I need to go make it right, that is the power of our faith. And when it's I can't admit I'm wrong because I could look like a fool and you won't love me or like me, or I'll lose my position. So guilt and toxic shame is definitely coming from a unaddressed inner life, and we don't have to live with it. It doesn't have to be a part of our everyday leadership.
Can guilt and shame be healthy?
Good question.
Very good question.
There's a difference, right? So,
yeah, because I'm thinking, like, if I'm really nasty to a coworker or my wife, hopefully I do feel a little bit guilty and a bit ashamed of my behavior. And it leads me to apologize. It leads me to change. It leads me to repentance. But you're also talking, on the other hand, about just this shame and, toxic guilt that isn't helpful. So I'm just curious. Yeah,
conviction is another way of that a person might feel when they've wronged someone. Right? And we want that, right? And we know that God wants that, and that's his Holy Spirit in us, those that follow him and have the Spirit in our lives, right? And that's different. That's like much more than all of us as humans have as conscience. Mm-hmm. It's so much more than that, right? And that is good. And that, in the scriptures, we understand that the Spirit's function is to remind us of everything that Jesus has taught us. That means that hopefully we've been reading and learning, and so in those moments we sense that conviction, that healthy guilt conviction to go and repair. Yeah. Totally different, right, than the toxic shame. And toxic shame is an attack on our identities, right? And in this, both in the clinical and the biblical integration here, right? Identity work. Toxic shame says it's a message like this. Will you always do that?
Right.
Or how come you can't fix this again? You're always going to be a loser or a failure, right? And that's the kind of toxic shame that God just says that's going to go. I'm going to help you get rid of that, because what you need to hear is you need to hear my voice, and it's his voice that matters. What he says about himself and what he says about us is the antidote to toxic shame. And the more we believe that, the more we take and pull the lies that come out that are tied to our trauma, usually, and we can separate those lies and start rejecting those lies. And the muscles of accepting the identity and the healthy identity of who we are is based on who he says we are, become stronger. And that's a very practical, everyday kind of challenge.
Yeah. So really, I just have to summarize because I want to, not because you didn't say anything beautifully, but just that sense of healthy guilt being about our behavior and toxic shame being about our identity. And
that's so good.
I did something wrong versus I am bad and I'm never fixable. So
right. Okay, that's such a helpful distinction. Yeah, because on the one hand, you can see some people who would say, well, you shouldn't feel ashamed for anything. That's just who you are. And I'm like, no, there's some stuff I need to own here. Right. And that's a helpful distinction. I want to circle back to the whole branding platform thing. So there's a lot of young leaders listening here. And as a guy in my 50s, most of the leaders who listen to this podcast are in their 20s and 30s. And there's a share of 40 and 50 and older, et cetera. But a lot of young leaders listening here. And I noticed the pressure. Like when I was in my 20s, there was no social media. I didn't have a brand. We were lucky to figure out how to brand our church. And I mean, that was so like, it was the Neolithic period, pretty much of branding, right? Like we didn't, what's that, Jeff?
The mission statement.
The mission statement, right? Exactly. But I've watched this catch on, and now couples have logos and looks, and we're in the era of face filters. And like, there are a few people I follow on Instagram, and I'm like, I don't know what you actually look like, because there's always a filter. It's like, whoa. And like, I have more wrinkles than I did last year, and I don't always match. And, I kind of am fairly comfortable showing my imperfections, but we're moving into a very different world very quickly. I'd love for you to talk about that. Is there an upside? Like,
is there an upside?
Is there an upside to branding?
Well, no. Is there an upside to that kind of pressure on yourself to project this perfect public image?
No. And I don't think there's an upside. I think it is part of the destruction on our identity and our sense of community and commitment to one another, to say, I love you and with all of who you are, warts and all. But the other piece to what you're saying is I see with the younger generation, and we're in our 40s, so we're kind of in between there of what you're talking about. But the idea that there's this vulnerability that you put out, but it's totally opposed.
Opposed vulnerability. That's a great phrase.
So that you're calling that vulnerability, but
cryptid vulnerability.
It took you 5 hours to get that picture just right. Like it's not the true raw. So that's the part that I kind of laugh, is that there's this longing for real and authenticity, and yet it still has to come through as a brand and with beauty. And it just is becoming so complex. And I think that pressure, it's difficult to be in social media and to not get squeezed by all that pressure. And so I think we have to be honest with our own vulnerabilities. I have a tendency towards addictions, meaning I see it in my family of origin. I see it in myself. I mean, I remember in high school loving the poker games. And I'm like, I should not go to Vegas because this is like the real deal. I really thrive on risk taking in those kinds of ways. So I have to be careful. And social media, I can feel the pull. So I didn't get on until this last year, not because I didn't think there's a place for it, but I know my vulnerabilities, and the reason I'm on it now is very different than what I would have been on 10 years ago. So if you can do it, or maybe there's some protocols that we have to put in place where we have somebody else do it for us. That's what we did for years, where somebody else is doing our social media. But the pressure is not healthy. It's killing our souls and it's killing our relationships. And that's my little soapbox there. So
asking the question, why am I anything is actually it's just, let's bring critical thinking back to the human race, please. And if we ask ourselves, and myself included, why am I doing this? And there's a good reason, a purposeful reason that makes good logic sense, or will add good, and you can back that up over time. Or people, if you were audited per se, theoretically, that you'd be guilty of seeing a track record of goodness and of building shows up in a meaningful connection and
Yeah.
right. Okay, great. Then step in. And we are real fans and rooting for the generations that are beneath us right now. And
Me
we're
too.
walking with them. We are not patronizing. We are not laughing. Every generation has its quirks. Man, we want to see this generation and our kids and those, right now, the millennials are leading our children right now. Our two girls, we got skin in this game. We want to thrive. And yet, in order for them to do that, because our offices in confidence are full of that generation, it's the only safe space they have to process and to say, I didn't have this modeled to me. How do I engage when I'm in letdowns or when people, when I was let go in an office scenario or in a workspace? Like we were having to help reparent in many cases, and now they're parents and they're also coming in, right, to try to figure out how to do this better for their kids. And so we are rooting for them. We are in there, and we need as many mentors and people as possible to come alongside in healthy ways, not to say, hey, we're perfect, follow us, but to say in our imperfection, follow us, walk with us together. Here's what we've learned as we follow Christ. Right?
Yeah, no, I'm really grateful for the conversation. And I would say I'm 100% committed to the next generation and the generations beyond. I'm a huge fan, not a critic. But I do wonder, having a long pre-digital memory, just because of when I was born, the platform and the pressure of leadership is hard enough where you feel you need to be one way on stage, but are you really that way behind stage? But now we all have a stage. It's called our phones. And I'm watching even the evolution in leaders in their teens and 20s. It's like I see that kind of influence come to them early. I've watched people I've followed for a few years kind of morph where, boy, you seem more real 3 years ago, and now everything's curated and branded and perfect. And I don't know, does that kill the soul at some point? Like, is this, because ultimately we're still humans, right? This is what I'm trying to drive at. This is very philosophical, but like at the end of the day, we're just like human beings who mess up, who are in need of grace. Like, are we headed to some kind of flashpoint or crisis generationally on that stuff? Because I'm a Gen X, but the 80s were very hyper techno music, and then the Gen X answer was grunge, right? So you got the whole grunge scene out of where you are, Portland and Seattle and the whole deal, and it was the opposite of the 80s. And I almost see us going in that direction. Music's so hyper produced, everything's so curated, everything's so perfect, and are we just going to implode under that pressure? End of rant. I'd love for you to see what you say.
I'll let you put in, because I know you have an opinion on this, but I think it's killing our souls. It's also killing our brains. Honestly, we are more ADD, technology induced. We can't pay attention to one another, let alone look each other in the eyes. Yeah. Getting back, it's why we wrote this book for this next generation, to say there are some basic things that still are important regardless of the times that have changed. Mm-hmm. And character matters more than charisma and branding. And though we have created a culture, and it started back in the 60s and 70s, that's been slow decline to a charisma and how you present yourself. And so what happens when I'm disconnected from who you see me to be and who I really am, it will eventually leak. And those 20, 30 somethings were saying you're headed towards a road of moral failure. That is where you're going. And so you've got to have a united, integrous life is one that's where everything is connected. So who I present myself to be on social media needs to also match out who I present myself to be with my husband.
Yeah, would your spouse recognize you? Would your best friend recognize you? Right? Yeah.
That's just that simple message. So it's not social media good or bad. It's just, is there congruency in your life and integration? Or are you feeling so fragmented because we cannot live like that? God didn't design us that way.
I'll just echo that to say, go back to original design, okay? And we have limits in our finite bodies, in our finite days, 24 hours a day. No one can add an hour to that. And there are limits. And when we learn to operate in love, actually love the limits, in our lives practically, and every person has different limits. Okay. So there's, right. So some people I can think of in my life are, I would say maybe in the top 5 energy of the world. And they wear me out when I just even hear them talk about what they did in a given first hour of their day, So their limits are different than my limits, but they have limits too. And they need to be aware of their limits. And so do I. And learning to love those limits and create sustainable systems that allow me to be the best version of who I am, not just who I want you to see me to be, but actually who I am. And that be consistent over time, because time is the great equalizer here. You cannot fool somebody for over lifetimes. Everyone. You can't fool everyone, right? So time, consistent over time, matching audio, matching the video. People that you would say that you care about the most, that they would say that they know that who you are and that you are a work in progress, and you are mostly the same person at home that you are out on the stage or in the stadium or wherever you might be, right? Those are very important things.
And if you're not, Carey, there's grace for that. It's the honesty, right? It's just to say, okay, I'm not doing it. Now I need to take some steps to start shrinking that gap, because it's a heavy burden to live disconnected.
Oh my gosh. And the energy that you recoup when you start shrinking your integrity gap, that you can apply to things that really matter. People come alive. You see it in their faces. You see it in them. You hear it in their voice. They're starting to slow down to a tune, not just to get their own needs met, but they're now interested in you. Tell me more about you, and tell me about your day. And it feels like that. That's a feeling that every human wants. They want people to be able to do that for them. And it requires you to be able to do that also.
Wow. And I just want to say to younger leaders listening, we're 100%, and all leaders, we're 100%. I am 100%. I know you guys are on your side. And, I'm thinking about what Tim Keller often says, that the gospel in a nutshell is fully known, fully loved. And we think that if we are going to be fully loved, we can't be fully known. And so I got to present an image of myself to you that will make you love me. Or, I just won't be fully loved. And the truth of the gospel is, no, you're fully known, you're fully loved. And I think that's where you guys are driving. We did a really good job, I think, of sort of explaining where the gaps are. And people should get your book. What are a couple of steps that people are like, some stuff got identified today. What do I do? Like, I know this is complicated for me. It's an ongoing multi-year journey, so multi-decade journey. So I realize it's not like, just take this pill, you'll be fine in the morning. What do you do?
First of all, I'd just say welcome to the club, right?
Yeah.
Welcome to the Human Leader Club, right? And those that are working to try to be the kinds of leaders that they would want to follow, right?
Right.
And, What do you got?
Yeah, I'll put my counselor hat on, and I would just say, let's start with your story. Do you know your story? I was classic leader, seen very early on with skills and gifts, and I was just put on the treadmill, and nobody ever took time to understand my story, nor did I know to even talk about my story. I might tell a moment in time, something happened, but when do we actually get to walk through our timeline? So in the book, we process, hey, you need to take time to know your story from 0 to now. And for those that have lived a long time, it feels a little more exhausting, and that's just the reality of it. But everything in your story is playing out today. And that is part of understanding your themes and your lies and the lessons and the principles, your convictions. So do you know your story? So I would say start there, and I remember doing my timeline in a linear fashion for the first time and realizing, oh my goodness, I moved a lot out of the ordinary. Not something I would have called traumatic, but I realized I was living out of a detached place with people because I had learned how to adapt quickly in all the moves that I had as a young girl. And I started to realize it was a small trauma in my story, and I needed to give some grace to that. And then I had to learn, how do I actually stay rooted and planted and actually go deeper in relationships? Because I'm really good at making new friends. But, past a few years, I don't know what to do past that. So it's things like that in our story when you listen to it in a linear way. So start with your story and start with sharing it with a counselor or a friend or a spouse. just one other person and see if you can start to hear the themes. I know that God shows us a lot of the lies that we tend to lean towards and some of the beautiful, unique parts of who we are. And we see our limits. We can learn a lot about ourselves through just understanding our story.
Yeah. And as Terra was saying, doing this in relationship is so key, right? You know, like a narcissist won't ever do that. They're not interested unless they're doing it to actually try to get you to a certain place that they want to get you to. That's why narcissists would pretend to be vulnerable. Yeah. Anyway, walk with someone in this process whom you trust and say, hey, look, I want to grow. I want to grow in my leadership. I want to become more of the leader that I would follow. I want to be more wholehearted. And I know that you do too. Would you do this with me? Would you walk through this work with me and look at these chapters and let's identify some vulnerabilities and let's talk them through. And that might lead to counseling, right? Yeah. It doesn't have to.
Doesn't have to.
But there's powerful transformation that takes place in relationship with one other person where you can agree, right? To be vulnerable and trust that it's not going to be used against you. And then, gosh, when a leader gets this and models that vulnerability in a healthy way, they want to take that to the people in their spheres of influence, right? And to especially, right? We love our pastors, Bill and Kathy. You know, they wrote the foreword to this, and they just were like, "Gosh, I resonated with chapters 3, 4, 7, 9, whatever." And to take that to somebody in a relationship, a young emerging leader, and say, "Look, let me tell you my story, but I also want to hear your story. And let me help you with some spaces that I'd identified in these chapters that might save you some time, heartache, and energy. If you're willing to hear that, would you like to do that with me? You know, it's as simple as that."
Mm-hmm.
Wow, it's been a great journey, and I just hope that this feels like help and hope to leaders listening who feel trapped. I think about how I would have heard this at 35. It would have felt very threatening. But 20 years later, it feels very comforting, actually, to have this conversation. So people are going to want to learn more. Tell us about the book, where they can find you online. We'd love to know more.
Absolutely. It's called Shrinking the Integrity Gap Between What Leaders Preach and Live. You can find it anywhere that retailers sell books. If you want to follow, I'm the only one on social media. So you can follow me at Terra Mattson, Terra. You can also follow us at Living Wholehearted. And we have a podcast called the Living Wholehearted Podcast where we unpack just all of the places that we lead and our leadership impacts in the home, work, and community. And so we'd love to be able to have you join us in this movement to shrink our integrity gap.
Love it. Thank you so much, Jeff and Terra. Really appreciate you.
Thank you, Carey.
Well, I hope today's episode was helpful to you. You can always get more by subscribing to my channel. I also have a lot more content over at CareyNieuwhof.com for leaders in business and leaders in churches. And you can get transcripts of this episode there and so much more, plus some other stuff I do for leaders. So head on over there to discover more at CareyNieuwhof.com. And in the meantime, I really hope our time together today has helped you lead like never before.